Okay, so today marks the beginning of when we look at specific ethical theories. We're going to look at 4 of them for the remainder of the class, and today we're going to start with utilitarianism. So let me give you some historical context. Utilitarianism starts in England in the 1700s and 1800s. And what's going on in England in the 1700s and 1800s? Well, if you're a woman, you don't have rights, can't vote, can't own property, all that kind of stuff. If you're a child, you can't be represented in court. You're just kind of at the mercy of your parents. If you're an animal, you might find yourself, in a dog fighting ring, cockfighting ring, being beaten by some cabbie whose cart you're pulling or whatever. If you're a prisoner, you can go to jail for just a ridiculous number of small crimes. You can be executed for all kinds of stuff. There's really no protection for how you're treated when you're in prison. Prisons are just these awful holes. And if you're poor, you're just totally out of luck, So utilitarianism starts as a response to how bad society can be for people who aren't at the top. The utilitarians want everybody to count the same. They want everybody to sort of count as one person, nobody to count as more than one person. They want to protect the interests of all these people that might normally be stepped on in society. That's the basic motivation. And so how do they do that? They think, well, if we want everyone to count the same, we have to find what everybody has in common, and we have to say that's the thing that really matters. So they think, well, people aren't all equally smart, so we can't say intelligence or rationality. We don't want to just say that people who do the right thing count. If you're a prisoner, we want your interests to count. So we're not going to say goodness or whatever. But everybody can suffer. Everybody can be happy. Everybody can feel pleasure. Everybody can feel pain. So the utilitarians end up saying, there we go. That's what we need. We want everyone to count the same. We're going to focus on what they have in common, and that's it. So the basics of utilitarianism, the theory, come out of this motivation. You can kind of sum up the theory in 3 main points. It's very simple, very clear in some ways. Point 1, the only thing that's valuable for its own sake is happiness. The utilitarians tended to think that was just obvious and everybody knew it. Point 2, they wanted to define happiness as pleasure. This is where they got into a lot of trouble with other people, as you'll see. So the only thing that's valuable for its own sake is happiness. Happiness is just the same as pleasure. Well, if that's all that's valuable for its own sake, surely the right thing to do is just to get as much of that as possible for everybody. So point 3, what makes something right? What makes something right according to utilitarianism is that it promotes the greatest happiness, which is the greatest pleasure, for the greatest number of people involved. So how do you know if an action is right? How do you know if you should lie or if you should tell the truth? Well, does it promote the greatest pleasure for everyone involved? Then it's the right thing to do. How do you know if you should save this person's life or that person's life? Well, does it promote the greatest amount of pleasure for everyone involved? Then it's the right thing to do. That's the basics of the theory. I mean, how do you do that? How do you decide that? How do you determine what's going to produce the most happiness? How do you determine what happiness looks like? Well, this is why utilitarianism has always been really friendly toward bringing science into ethics. So psychology is going to help you figure out what'll make people happy, what happiness looks like. Economics is going to help you calculate what to do, how to get the most happiness. And actually, utilitarianism has been really influential on economics. So John Stuart Mill, great utilitarian, was one of the main economists for a really long period of the history of economics. Even today, if you study economics, um, when you calculate the best possible outcome in economics, you call it the expected utility because of the influence that utilitarianism had on economics. So utilitarianism is still tremendously influential if you look at the kind of people who are making policy recommendations on really big issues that affect tons of people. Most of the time, some form of utilitarianism is how they're making that calculation. So that's how you sort of can apply science to these things according to the utilitarians. But you still might wonder, well, that's all well and good, but how do you determine which pleasures count? Do they all count the same? Are some pleasures more important than others? And here the utilitarians are going to disagree among themselves. So Jeremy Bentham, kind of the first utilitarian, he thought, yeah, they all count the same. If you want to spend your time reading Proust and looking at Mark Rothko paintings in the Guggenheim Museum, that's great. But it doesn't count any more than if you just want to sit on your couch, eat potato chips, and watch the game. It all counts the same. He wanted to make it all count the same because he really wanted the interests of everybody to count the same. So if you didn't have good taste, or if you didn't have opportunities for education or whatever, he didn't want you to count for less just because, you just want to sit around and drink Diet Coke instead of like Pinot Noir or something. But then there was this objection people started making. They said, so you're telling me all that matters in life is pleasure, and all pleasures are equally valuable. Well, in that case, why should I even try to have what is obviously a good human life with friends and activities that are meaningful and, stimulating my brain and stuff like that? Why don't we just all lie on comfy beds, hook up to some morphine, and call it a day? That produces just as much happiness as a lot of other things. Why is that a worse life than being in a community and having all these activities I'm engaged with and making a difference in the world? So they didn't like Jeremy Bentham's idea that all pleasures counted the same. So John Stuart Mill, kind of a second generation utilitarian, said, no, some pleasures do count more than others. There are higher quality pleasures and there are lower quality pleasures. What makes them one or the other? Well, higher quality pleasures, and this is in the reading, are going to be those that engage more of your thoughts and your feelings and emotions and your mind. Lower quality pleasures, they're good, but they're just sensation. They're just what makes you feel good, not what really, gets your brain moving or tugs at your heartstrings. So a lower quality pleasure is going to be something like, eating chocolate, or if you get in a really good stretch, which I recommend, you should do it right now. Get in a good stretch. Higher quality pleasures, that's going to be things like friendship, poetry, watching a movie. You got to follow the plot, think about the movie. Maybe it sort of gets you invested in the characters. A game of football where you're strategizing, you're coordinating all your various people, keeping an eye on what everybody's doing. That's all engaging your mind. And you're really invested in it. You really want to win. You get really excited, so it engages more of your feelings too. So football would count as a higher pleasure for the same reason. So Bentham thinks all pleasures count the same. There's this problem. Why don't we just have a crude, gross, boring life instead of what's obviously a better human life? Mill comes back with, well, there is this distinction. The higher quality pleasures, they count for more because they engage more of the whole person. They're not just about feeling good. So that's his response to that. There's still sort of one big problem that's always stuck with utilitarianism that it hasn't been able to shake. And for each theory I'm going to close with one big problem that it hasn't totally ever got rid of. And I'm not going to be able to solve it they can come back with an answer, and then you can come back with another version of the problem, back and forth, on and on. I'm just going to present it. So for utilitarianism, kind of the main problem that comes up again and again and again is, what about rights? What about things that you should just never do to anybody for any reason? Because if what counts are the outcomes, if you're just always looking ahead to producing as much pleasure for everybody as you can, what about what you do to get it? What about what you do on the way? So there's this story by Ursula Le Guin, I highly recommend, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. You're supposed to imagine this city where, there's no war, there's no oppression, there's no real misery. People just live in music and laughter and joy and dancing all the time. But they all know that the only thing that makes that possible is that somewhere in their city there's a basement containing a child kept by themselves, no pleasure, no love, no sunlight, no activity, just trapped there. And so you're supposed to think, it can't be right to base everybody else's happiness on just destroying the life of one other person. But for utilitarianism, why not? If you can produce the most pleasure for everyone involved by stomping on the rights of one other person, utilitarianism is going to say, that doesn't sound very nice, but it's the right thing to do. And it doesn't even have to be only one other person. As long as most people have as much pleasure as possible, you might stomp on the rights of a lot of other people, but you're still producing the most pleasure for everybody involved. So that's the main problem that utilitarianism hasn't really totally succeeded in getting around. There's various moves they've tried that we would go into if we had more time. But for now, I just leave you with the main points and sort of the main problem that they face. So next lecture, I'll talk about how all this might apply to animals, and we'll talk about Peter Singer and his arguments.